Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show sponsored by the Future of Freedom Foundation that brings you the Libertarian Angle on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's great to be back with you and our viewers and listeners.
Now, we got a special show today. Last week we sent out an email and posted on Facebook and Twitter that we were soliciting questions on the topic of open borders, which is a long-time libertarian position, part of the libertarian philosophy. And we thought, well, it'd be nice to see what's on people's minds, see what questions they have. And, well, lo and behold, I got inundated by questions. I mean, it's around, 40 or so emails asking questions about the various aspects of libertarianism, and so we're gonna do that in this show. We're gonna answer those questions that hopefully will reach all of them. There's been some overlap, as you would expect, but there's also a large number of questions that do not overlap. So we'll do our best, and we'll start heading on down the list. The first question was the obvious one, like, what do you guys really mean by open borders, or what do libertarians mean by open borders? So I'll begin, Richard, and then you give your response. Open borders are simply a way of life in which the government is prohibited from interfering with the free movements of people. So you have private establishments, ranches or farms or something. We're not saying that people should be free to trespass on those, but we're saying that on the public roads and bridges that connect countries, that the system should be the same as we have here in the United States, where people are free to cross from Maryland into Virginia using the public roads and crossing the public bridges. So it would be for public roads and public bridges in between Mexico and the United States, or Canada and the United States. And of course, the same principle in airports. People are free to cross from one part of the country to another part of the country by flying from, say, California to Virginia. The same principle would apply internationally, so that people don't have a right to trespass onto somebody's private property, but they have a right to come into the country, rent property to live in, a home, open a business, work in a business. In other words, the same principle that applies domestically on crossing borders would apply internationally. What do you think, Richard?
Well, let me sort of present it in the following way. Imagine that someone anywhere in the world purchases a ship ticket or an airline ticket, but let's use the example of a ship, boarding a ship somewhere else in the world. They privately buy the ticket from a private shipping company, a commercial passenger ship, and they dock at a privately owned dock in, let us say, Lower Manhattan in New York City. And they proceed to hire a private taxi cab to transport them to a private hotel with whom they have made a reservation. And then the hotel willingly gives them a room. And during their stay at the hotel, they buy a privately published newspaper and proceed to look through the want ads, through which they find a prospective employer who might privately, through mutual agreement, choose to hire them. And then with the income that they have now started earning, they rent, through voluntary and mutual agreement, a house or an apartment. And they proceed to spend the income that they've honestly earned through the voluntary employment that they've acquired, the goods and services and the amenities that they might want. And they might even save part of their income and choose to buy similar privately purchased and provided means of transportation for their family members, and they bring them to the United States. I don't see how anyone could object to that, regardless of where that new resident and person living and working in the United States is coming from anywhere in the world. It has not violated anyone's rights. It has been through the mutual agreement and exchange of two parties through every step of the process. And as long as that individual acts honestly and justly, and that is, he does not violate any individual's right to his life, liberty, and personal property, I don't see how there is any basis in a principle of freedom to attempt to restrict, obstruct, or prohibit such a person from entering the United States. Now, in a free society, that is how it would operate, and indeed is not just theory. Certainly before the First World War, that was the condition under which millions of people, tens of millions of people, came to the United States as immigrants from other parts of the world, at that time predominantly from different areas of Europe. But that's how it's worked. And certainly the government would have had no right or prohibition to restrict them. Now that seems to be the logic and the principle that the advocate of liberty should be espousing and defending in today's system of government control of borders.
Yeah, in a sense, there's just no government control of borders. Now, let's see. I'm looking at my list of questions, and one of our readers named Richard says, but doesn't a country have a right to protect its sovereignty? What do you say about that, Richard?
Well, it seems to me is that the Constitution does specify under who is a citizen. And as a citizen, the law does specify who has the right to vote. Minors don't have a right to vote. Someone who has certain types of prison records, having committed certain crimes, I understand, are restricted in their voting rights. But that determines who gets to vote. And sovereignty refers to the citizen's ability to, within the jurisdiction of that country, to elect representatives to the institutions of government, that is, a state legislature or the U.S. Congress. But while the citizen has that right of sovereignty, his right of sovereignty, in my judgment, does not permit him to use his vote, and let's suppose as a majority of the country, to then infringe upon the rights of other human beings who are peacefully and honestly going about their business, but some of whom may have come here from another country to be living and working and residing. So people have a sovereign right to elect their representatives, but from a classic liberal libertarian point of view, sovereignty is concerned with the election of representatives who will protect and enforce the rights of the citizenry, not violate them. Now, the violation comes in not just by precluding the foreign individual, by foreign I mean the citizen or the resident of another country coming to the United States, you are violating the rights of Americans. What about the American who owns that shipping line, who wants to sell a ticket to transport that foreign individual to the United States, or who operates the private cab that I talked about in my earlier example, or who would like to rent a room to him and anyone else in their hotel, or hire him or anyone else of similar qualifications for that job? Every American's right in that two-sidedness of every transaction and exchange would have their individual rights violated under the principles of the United States as originally found.
Yeah, I mean, you're making a fascinating point. I mean, Thomas Jefferson talks in the Declaration of Independence about fundamental God-given natural rights that adhere to all men, not just Americans. And the idea is that no government can legitimately infringe on these rights as part of its sovereign powers. And that includes people who are exercising rights such as freedom of travel, freedom of movement, economic liberty, liberty of contract, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the like. But there's another aspect of this too, Richard, that, I think when people talk about sovereignty, they're talking about that if you have foreigners coming in, that somehow or another affects the power or jurisdiction of the government in that jurisdiction, which is nonsense. Just because people are free to come into a jurisdiction, that doesn't affect the power of the government to enforce its laws. For example, here, thousands or countless, I should say, people from Maryland come into Virginia every day. We don't know how many there are. We don't count. The government doesn't count them, doesn't monitor it. And yet, when they come in, they are subject to the laws of Virginia. They cannot say, well, I'm a Marylander and therefore I'm not I don't have to comply with your laws. And it's the same thing with foreign citizens. They come into the United States, or they come into, let's say, Texas. They are now, on the moment of crossing that border, subject to Texas law. And so it doesn't, the free movements of people across borders does not affect the sovereign power of the government with which they're dealing. All right, now here's a common one that Kate and Pete and John and James and Joe all raised, and they're sort of variations on a theme, but let's deal with each one. The big one, Richard, is that immigrants come and get on welfare. And they're essentially repeating the old Milton Friedman line that as long as you have a welfare state, you can't have immigrants or open borders, because the idea is they're going to come and get on welfare. That's going to cause the tax burden to go up, and we're all going to end up working to support foreign citizens. What do you think about that?
Well, that is not just a variation of a similar domestic policy theme. For example, during the 8 years in which Barack Obama was in the White House, through the administrative state, as it's referred to, the rules and regulations were weakened, loosened, for how easily one could be eligible for disability benefits under Social Security. The result being is that from the articles I've seen, there's a huge increase in the amount of people who can be in their 20s and then, in principle, for the rest of their life, collect Social Security benefits under the disability clause. This is the same problem. I mean, you either accept the fact that if the state allows these things, it's going to have both intended and unintended consequences. But that would be like saying that no longer could a previously employed person in California immigrate to, let's say, South Carolina, where I live, and now choose not to work and collect federal and then state disability benefits if the state of South Carolina offers them. I don't know. I assume so. And because allowing them into South Carolina would place a burden on the people of South Carolina. Now, let me sort of give a slightly variation of this, which touches on another thing that the question is asked. What about the influence not just on the welfare state, but culture? Now, I've been down in South Carolina for 3 years now. I spent my life as a Yankee, and now I'm in South Carolina, and I have discovered that a lot of more native South Carolinians are very upset by the vast influx of people down here from the north. And the reason is that while, as in all parts of the country, there are different political diversities, South Carolina is a predominantly what would normally be considered right of center state. A lot of conservatives and a noticeable number of even libertarians. And all these people from the Northeast or the Midwest, read Illinois, Michigan, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, are damn commie left-wing pinkos who will be voting to pass laws that will weaken the restrictions on the welfare state here at the state level, and will change the complexion of the politics in general. So somewhat facetiously, some of them say, we need a wall, not on the Mexican border, but on the border between North and South Carolina, and make New York and Connecticut pay for it. The fact is that we would consider that ludicrous. The fact is that what is called for is not to keep people out because they might be eligible for an existing welfare benefit that is not as generous in their home state, or the fact that there's an ideological political complexion that will then influence the politics of your state with the arrival of intrastate immigration. It's the fact that it requires the friend of freedom to redouble his efforts to explain to all in his area on the principles and value and importance of freedom, rather than to impose new restrictions or redouble any restrictions that already existed, because then to do so, you are in the name of wanting to protect freedom, violating another aspect of freedom. And that is a dilemma in this that has to be faced. Now, I understand Milton Friedman's argument. It's just that if you have a welfare state, um, you can't have an open border, he argues, because then people will come to get a benefit that they can't get in their own country. But as I was alluding to, that is the same thing, is that if welfare benefits are more easily accessible and are more generous in state X compared to state Y within the United States, does that mean that state X, because they're more generous, then should have borders against residents of states Y and Z from immigrating to them? That's the problem. The solution is to eliminate the attractiveness of redistributive programs by eliminating the redistributive programs rather than imposing a new intervention and restriction on freedom over one that already is egregiously there.
Yeah, your point about South Carolina reminds me of Texas when there was the big banking crisis many years ago that was causing New Yorkers to move to Texas, people on Wall Street and everything. Signs started appearing all over Dallas that said, "We don't care how you did it in New York." And of course they were acknowledging that New Yorkers are brash, they can be obnoxious, and they were coming down saying this is how you should do things here in Texas. They were trying to change Texas culture.
Right.
And so, yeah, in a sense, open borders are dangerous in that sense, that you bring in people with different ideas. And in fact, some of our questioners brought that up, that, hey, they're socialists, that if you open the borders, you could get a whole flood of socialists are going to change our system. So in a sense, I mean, freedom is dangerous, but as you're suggesting, the opposite is even worse, because in order to, if trying to protect yourself from these possibilities, that you end up with a tyrannical regime. I mean, look at the enforcement regime that comes with immigration controls. You know, the whole border is like a police state now along the southern border. Checkpoints, highway checkpoints, roving border patrol checkpoints, warrantless searches of farms and ranches, raids on businesses. So, you know, it's that old saying that when you trade liberty, because liberty's dangerous for security, you end up without liberty and you end up without security. And you know, and really, Richard, what is American culture? I mean, you've got diversity of culture. That's our culture. Look at New Orleans or South Carolina, Charleston. Those are different cultures from New York City and San Francisco or my hometown of Laredo, where like a third of the people or so, 20% of the people, don't even speak English. So America's always been this diversity of cultures, Chinatown in San Francisco. This is something we should relish. And so when people bring in the diverse cultures, we should embrace this as saying, hey, our culture is a culture of liberty. Now, in the welfare state argument, I think you hit the nail on the head. As libertarians, we have to stick with our principles. Now, the first question you have to ask, are border controls a violation of the principles of liberty? And I don't think there's any question that they are. They're interfering with economic liberty, freedom of movement, liberty of contract, all of which are fundamental rights. And so should we libertarians be maneuvered or postured because you have a welfare state into joining up with the statists and saying, okay, we're going to align with you statists and call for more tyranny because it happens to be more burdensome in terms of higher taxes? I don't think so. I don't think we as libertarians ever want to be put in the position of taking statist positions because it might be expedient to do so. As you point out, we need to stay focused on eliminating the wrongdoing, eliminating the welfare state, the Social Security, the Medicare, the Medicaid, the public schooling, and so forth that people are saying are attracting the immigrant. And as a practical matter, Richard, most people are not going to uproot themselves. It's very difficult to go to a foreign country where you don't speak the language, where you have to get a job, where you're abused and insulted. Most people around the world, they just don't have that intestinal fortitude. The immigrant that leaves his family and his culture and his homeland and his language, He's a special breed, and they're always a net positive to a society. They bring vitality, entrepreneurship, hard work, a work ethic, many times strong religious values. They're the kind of gift that a society should relish. And so as we libertarians, I mean, even if there are a few people coming to get on welfare, why do we want to punish the vast majority who are not? I mean, where's the justice in that by prohibiting them all from coming in? So we should stay focused on ending the wrongdoing. And finally, another example of this is like the drug war. Should we libertarians call for supporting the drug war until Medicaid is abolished? Because people might go on Medicaid to get cured for drug addiction if drugs are legalized? Perish the thought. We should stay focused on ending the drug war and at the same time stay focused on ending the welfare state.
And another sort of complement or extension of what you've just said is that there's a tendency to lump all immigrants together. It's a very collectivist concept in a country founded on individualism. As in the past, many people come to the United States for a wide, diverse number of reasons. For instance, some do come here to escape from religious persecution. We've been seeing that in a number of cases. There are Muslims who have been coming to the United States who have found a religious persecution because of the Muslim fanatics, the Islamic fundamentalists as they're called, in the Middle East, the Al-Qaedas and the Islamic State types. They're escaping from religious persecution to come to the United States, no different than Jews who came from Imperial Russia, or Catholic or Protestants who might have come from a Catholic country, or Catholics from a Protestant country of the past. There's also the fact that, as you were just saying, coming to another country involves a huge changing of one's circumstances. You don't know the language usually, you don't know the culture, you don't have the street smarts, you're starting off fresh in an alien environment. The type of person who does that usually is a risk taker, a self-starter, entrepreneurial in the most broadest sense, not just market entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurial in spirit, about taking a chance to try to make a better life for themselves. And to therefore presume that every immigrant is like this is absurd. Now, there's also the fact that there's unintended consequences. One could easily go back, I suppose, and do an historical study of the children of immigrants of the 19th century. And you'd probably find that in some cases, the parents of that eventual young person born within the United States were bums, drunkards, scoundrels, people trying to skip out on the law, and you know, going to America to get out of the radar screen of their home country, to use that kind of metaphor. And then they have children, and their children end up being artistic or literary geniuses, famous innovators or inventors or entrepreneurs. It seems a little strange to not take into consideration that the bum of today might create the child of the genius of tomorrow. And you never know. Just as the genius that you let in, I mean, people talk about a merit system. Oh, if they have like a $500,000 and they're going to start a business, they could have children that are ideological commies and welfare bums. You have no idea what you're getting. But what you shouldn't do is to violate the principle of freedom, that people should have the right to move where and when they want.
Yeah, I mean, there's a risk that American parents will raise children that are socialists also. And so,
no, never. No person ever born in America ever generated progeny that were collectivists and socialists. It's never happened, Jacob. I don't know where you get these ideas.
Well, maybe we should have the government control licensed parental responsibilities and so forth. Take the children out of the hands of the parents so that they be total libertarians and free enterprisers. I mean, freedom is risky, Richard. Now, I think it's also important to point out that just because you have open borders doesn't mean that you have everyone becoming American citizens. I mean, you can have a system where people come in and retain their citizenship. You can make whatever requirements you want for citizenship. Make them as stringent as you want. That means that people are not voting except back in their home country. This is not unusual. I have a friend who's Japanese. She's been here 20 years. She's a Japanese citizen. She chooses to be. She votes back in Japan. And she speaks with an accent. Her son is now a physician here in the United States, or I forget what her daughter does. And so there's nothing wrong with that. You have Americans retiring in Mexico who retain their American citizenship. You have Americans working in Paris who remain Americans. Open borders simply means the right to move and travel and trade, invest, open up businesses. It has nothing to say about citizenship. Now, Richard, you raised a point that some of the
Jacob.
Yeah.
If I can just continue with that theme that you just talked about, I would even argue that given the existing welfare state and the concern of some people, Americans, that foreign immigrants will come in and become eligible for it, not only does the citizenry have a right to determine the eligibility to become a citizen, but a whole variety of other things. You can reside in the United States, as you were just saying, and not have the right to vote in the United States, even though you could be living here for 10, 20, 30 years. That means that you are a second-class citizen in one sense, in that you live in the country, you're under its laws, but you have taxation and regulatory obligations with no representation, having chosen to live here as a non-citizen for whatever period of lengthy time. I see no reason why, given the welfare state, that it couldn't be said any immigrant starting on day X because you can't make it retroactive, is free to come into the United States and voluntarily live, work, interact, etc., but they and their children are ineligible for any and all welfare benefits, great, small, of any shade and type, Medicare, Social Security, government schooling, the first 10 years of their time in the United States. I'm just using that as an example. And that should alleviate the fears or concerns of some who are fearful of the welfare burden, because that can be set up as the terms under which you can come and live in the United States in any sense. But what should not be violated is obviously anyone's rights in the United States to their life, liberty, and property, and the freedom to move for peaceful and honest purposes.
Right. I wish they'd give us that option as well. We don't have to participate in their system, but I think it'd be nice also to exempt people from taxation when they're not getting those programs. But in any event, Richard, you mentioned something that some of the questioners asked, and that's that what about people who bring in crime, terrorism, and disease? Doesn't a nation have a right to protect itself from that?
Okay. Let me take the perhaps the easiest one, and that is disease. Now, even in the 19th century, when immigration was virtually unrestricted, no passports, no visas, if you arrived, let's say, in New York City, obviously back then it would, in the 19th century, be by ship, and when they had opened Ellis Island, the immigration entree point at the mouth of the Hudson River, just south of Manhattan, there were government agents there as you disembarked on Ellis Island. But as I understand it, they were restricted to basically asking two questions. A, did you have a communicable disease? That's a health issue. And if you had a communicable disease, was there an incubation period? If there was, you were just held in quarantine on Ellis Island, and when the incubation period had passed, you could no longer be contagious for others. You were free to board a ferry, and off you go to southern Manhattan. The other question, to use what is now a politically incorrect term, was, are you an imbecile? That is, do you have mental defect that would prevent you from being self-supporting? And by that time, they meant not government welfare, but private charity. Basically, if you didn't have one of those, you weren't an imbecile, and you didn't have a contagious disease, that was it. That was it. Now, they kept a record of people's names. For example, I was able to find, because the world of the internet, uh, the date and ship when some of my grandparents arrived on Ellis Island. So they kept a record of things. That's just statistics, right, for the Census Bureau. But that was the limit of it. I would even argue about the imbecile issue, because then it's voluntary charity. But the issue is that disease is certainly a concern. That could be a matter. Uh, but other than that, I see no reason and circumstance for the government to interfere with this. Now, the other issues about crime and so on. I mean, there are areas that are more crime-ridden than in some states. Illinois, particularly Chicago, is notorious for street violence, when hundreds of people are being killed day and night there by street violence. You could say that there's a concentration of thugs, murderers, criminals of various and sundry sorts in the Chicago area. Does that mean that you should now set up immigration barriers at the borders of other states to prohibit people from Illinois from coming to, let's say, Arkansas or Massachusetts or Nevada until they have had a criminal record check? I think that would be considered absurd. Now, the same thing could happen. There are honest people who might want to come to the United States, and there are dishonest people. The same applies about people moving across borders. But again, I see no reason to see about a concern about restricting this. You should accept the principle of freedom of movement. If an individual commits a crime, or under the rules of law enforcement is suspected of about to perform a criminal act, well, then they're in that state of that state's jurisdiction, and that's the purpose of law enforcement. But you wouldn't say that a person should be held guilty for a crime that has not yet been committed or is imminent. So as a consequence, I think that cannot be a basis for that. Any more than I'll even take even the stronger one, terrorism. Well, most terrorist acts in the United States, with the exception, of course, the tragedy of 9/11, these were people who had come here on visas. Most of these have been performed either by native-born Americans or people who had been here for decades and then had a change of their ideas. The same way native-born Americans clearly had some change in their ideology, their religious faith, to make them go wacko and do these violent, crazy acts. So to even use that as a basis seems unreasonable and unjustifiable.
Yeah, I think your analogy of the domestic United States is perfect. I mean, we have criminals in the United States. We have terrorists in the United States. Do we want to put immigration barriers around each state to prevent those criminals in that state and those terrorists in that state from crossing state lines to go to another state? Well, on the surface of things, it would seem like, yeah, that would make us safer. But again, we take the position that, wait a minute, our freedom is more important than our safety. And so while it's dangerous that you have open borders here in the United States, because criminals and terrorists can cross state lines and go and wreak havoc in another state, we don't want to sacrifice our freedom for that pretense of security. And a good example of that was many years ago here in Virginia. There were two men who were suspected from being from Maryland that were coming into Virginia and randomly shooting people.
Yes, I remember that.
And nobody ever called for border controls between Virginia and Maryland to check everybody's trunk, to look for weapons, none of that. People said it's just not worth it to sacrifice our freedom, and they ultimately caught the guys and sent them away to jail. Now, so the same principle applies. Let's say you've got 1 million immigrants come into the United States. Most of them are not terrorists. Most of them do not have a communicable disease. Why infringe on their rights? Why not take all the resources that you're using to control those 1 million people, or monitor those 1 million people, or keep them out, and focus all the resources on just ferreting out violent crime? And then when you limit your law enforcement agencies to doing that, as you say, the people that are committing the crimes or in the process of preparing to commit the crimes, now all of a sudden you have a much more efficient system without destroying the rights of the vast majority, the 99%, that are peaceful, law-abiding people.
Yeah, we need to remember this point, that in a free society, people accept that freedom is not costless. Freedom of speech, in spite of the totalitarianism going on some American campuses around the country, most Americans accept the idea that freedom of speech will require you to hear things or know that ideas are being shared that you vehemently disagree with. That's the price of freedom. To secure your own freedom of speech and the press and conscience, you recognize that you must reciprocally do it so for all others, even when those others will say things and espouse things and argue things that you find reprehensible, repugnant, and even morally terrible. The same thing applies with law enforcement. The fact is that we know that often crimes are not solved, or someone who, quote, we know really committed the crime gets off. And they get off because a search warrant couldn't be undertaken to find the evidence that would have been there in some objective, godlike perspective. Yet the evidence was there, but the police couldn't get to it, so the guy gets off. Or there's some technicality during the trial of a violation of the evidence or the testimony, and so on and so forth. We accept the fact that in a free society, bad people will sometimes get away with a crime. But we accept that because we believe that the restrictions on government and the law enforcement agencies to prevent the violation of the rights of the vast majority of us innocent people who want to go about our free personal and private affairs is a price worth bearing to preserve an environment in which the state does not violate, encroach, bend, twist, until finally all of us are threatened with living under a state of legal arbitrariness rather than a system of law.
Yeah, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't point out that the root cause of anti-American terrorism, at least, is U.S. interventionism abroad. And so if you really want to get rid of the terrorism, the idea is not more tyranny with massive border controls trying to protect us from the repercussions of U.S. foreign policy. The solution is to bring all the troops home and stop the interventionism and the killing at the hands of the U.S. government in overseas lands. Richard, I know we've gone over time. Do you have time to stick around? We got just a few more questions I think that we haven't addressed.
Sure, we can take a little bit more time, no problem.
All right, Nicholas and Owen said that, look, how are open borders different from an invasion and conquest? That these people are coming in and taking over America, and the Muslims among them are going to establish Sharia law. And some of them pointed to Native Americans and point out and say, look what happened to Native Americans, or who used to be called Indians, when you had open borders. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think the language itself is already trying to set the terms of an invasion. You could argue, and I would even speak to that particular individual who raised that question. Should his ancestors have been viewed as invaders into the United States when they came to the U.S. as immigrants, whether it be his grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, or maybe even his parents? Were they invaders from a different country, an alien culture, a different linguistic group than English? Were they threatening the cohesion of America? And if the same fears that he's expressing had been present and enforced at that time when his ancestors arrived, where the hell would he be today? The fact is that these fears have been expressed time after time. Let me go through the litany. In the 1840s, there was a great concern that the Irish were coming. There was the famine, the potato famine in Ireland. And there was this wave of Irish immigrants. Oh, the Irish are coming in. They're going to undermine our society. Well, first of all, they're Catholics. That means they worship the Pope. And they can't be true and real American citizens obeying the Constitution. And we all know they're drunks. They're going to undermine the youth of America. Then the Germans came in the 1860s and early 1870s, many of whom were draft dodgers, escaping from Bismarck's wars with military conscription in Prussia and Germany. Those Germans, they cluster together in little communities, and they keep speaking German. They won't learn English. and they have their strange beer stein customs. They cluster together and get drunk with their German beer, and then on Sunday they keep occupying the local park and have some type of weird militaristic pa band play that really weird music. Oh, the Germans, they'll never become real Americans. And then the same thing happened in the 1880s and 1890s with the Poles and other Eastern Europeans. And then in the 1890s, in the first decade of the 20th century, the Jews are arriving from Russia. Oh my God. They killed Jesus. And they capture little babies, Christian babies, and use the blood of Christian babies to make matzah, their unleavened bread. Oh no, it's the end of America. Now, on the one hand, I'm being sarcastic, but this is how some people, argued in the United States in the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century about wave after wave of different types of immigrants from different parts of just Europe, forget about the world, and that this was the end of America, the cultural disintegration of the United States, the loss of the fabric of our country. Well, it's now the early decades of the 21st century, and a large majority of us are the descendants of those alien elements that came to America in the 19th century and the early 20th century. We're the product of them. And by golly, I am a real American. And now, there's another theme that you raised earlier in passing, and that is the cultural diversity. We have Italian restaurants, Mexican food, Chinese cuisine, Japanese cooking, on and on. Healthier, more vibrant, more creative and choice-filled by allowing this inundation of so many other cultures, other than just different groups from Europe, into the melting pot of America. America is strong by all of these strands and strains and peoples. The poison is not America's melting pot. The poison that is to be fought are those in America who oppose a melting pot, who refuse to accept the philosophy of individualism and the respect and the autonomy of the individual, and like leftists for decades have attempted to collectivize us. You're the capitalist versus the working class. You're the white person versus the black person. You're the Hispanic versus the Asian. This collectivist classification and the insistence that is where rights and privileges come from, rather than the dignity and basic existence of the individual, is the poison. That's not coming from outside. That's the intellectuals and the political demagogues and the academic ivory tower collectivists here in the United States that are preventing America from continuing to be the strength-creating melting pot that made our country great. So that's not an alien force. It's the poison in the water. It's the indigenous ideologues and intellectuals within the country itself.
Yeah, as you know, Richard, the first generation immigrant comes in, he can hardly speak English, thick accent, still talks about the home country. The second generation, the children are bilingual, they have a sense of what life was like in the old country. By the time of the third generation, the grandchildren don't know the language. They're kind of embarrassed that their grandparent speaks with a thick accent. They've been absorbed. I mean, that's what inevitably happens here in the United States, that the immigrant doesn't change America. The immigrant absorbs America absorbs the immigrant or his children or grandchildren, and they become Americanized. Now,
if I can just add to that point as a professor, when I was a student growing up in the greater New York City area back in the 50s and the 60s, it was very common for both adults and their children to refer to themselves as Irish American, Italian American, Polish American. Now, I have been a professor for a long time, and I sometimes, when beginning of the semester, I take the attendance roll, and I try to correctly pronounce the students' names. And I asked them, oh, where are you from? What your major is? That's an interesting last name. Do you know where your grandparents or others came from? Now, when I was young, most kids could still say, and by the way, that was the 1960s, not the 1860s, when I was young. They knew, well, my parents came from around Palermo in Italy, or they came from around Stockholm in Sweden, or. I find that the students today, if I ask that question, do you know where your grandparents or great grandparents came from? They don't know. They've never asked. And even more interestingly, they don't care.
Right.
They have been totally immersed within one culture, the American culture, which is the epitome of this diversity and complexity, rather than a uniform cookie-cut notion of what you have to be and how you have to act.
Right, and there's no semblance of an accent. Let me just address this conquest thing for a moment. That an invasion is what happened when the U.S. invaded Iraq. You have bombs, missiles, planes, torture, prison camps. That's an invasion. When immigrants are coming into the United States, there are no bombs, there's no missiles, there's no death, there's no destruction. They're simply people who are getting jobs or touring, investing, or what have you. It's all peaceful activity. Even with the Native Americans, you had the U.S. Army that was out there killing Native Americans. There is no militarized army with immigrants into the United States. They're just peaceful individuals seeking to pursue happiness. Now, Richard, the final question, and this is, I think, one of the most important, so I'd like us to take the time to answer it, is this. Doug says, look, what's wrong with the government determining qualifications for immigrants? We need special skills in certain industries, certain businesses. What's wrong with the government determining those skills, Richard? And the other aspect he asks of this is that, can this really be beneficial to a developed economy as compared to a burden?
I would argue that this is the same premise, interventionist premise, that is used domestically, usually by people on what we call the left, but it's not unheard of sometimes by people on the conservative right. Young Americans are not being trained for the right jobs. They're not getting the right education to prepare them for a career that will offer them gainful employment and strengthen America. Well, the response to that is the standard response that every classical liberal, libertarian, in fact, right-thinking conservative should have. How the hell does a bunch of government bureaucrats and politicians know what education people need or should have? It's the entire argument against socialist central planning. The government has neither the knowledge, wisdom, or ability to know better than the people themselves how to integrate themselves into their market transactions for mutual benefit, using more opportunities and knowledge than any planner or regulator can ever possess. How does the customs agent and the bureaucracy above him know what skills, what abilities, what educational background, what training a person should have to successfully integrate into the United States economy? Nobody has that knowledge. The very purpose of the market is to discover what are the skills and knowledge and abilities people have, and for people to discover the opportunities for them to get educated or trained or retrained to fit into the market opportunities that they stumble upon. To say that we're only going to let people into the country who meet these educational or experience or job descriptions as determined by the state is just another form of the government attempting to centrally plan, this time, the composition and content and form of the labor force. That is no different than the government presuming to know where private businessmen should invest their capital to assure a prosperous America in the future. It's just another example of the central planning mentality.
Yeah, and central planning is a variation on the socialist theme. I mean, that's where you had all the chaos in the Soviet Union. So here's the irony going full circle. People are concerned with open borders might bring in socialists, but they erect this gigantic socialist structure to protect them from this so-called danger. And as Mises pointed out, you have planned chaos. I mean, that's why we've had an ongoing immigration crisis ever since I was a kid, Richard. As long as I can remember, there's been an immigration crisis, and that's because of central planning. That the market is the best determinant. I mean, that's why you got crops in California that are rotting in the fields, because the central planner said, well, you don't need that many farm workers. Or I read an article where carnivals are having a difficult time having to shut down rides because the government decided they don't need as many immigrants to do the cleanup, the nasty cleanup that a lot of Americans don't want to do. So the market, it works. I mean, the free market works. And as we've learned with central planning, it doesn't work. So to recap here, we have a system of open borders. It's a moral system. It treats people like we would want to be treated, the golden rule. It's consistent with biblical principles, love thy neighbor as thyself, and it works. It's the only thing that works. Nothing's going to work except free markets. Any final words, Richard?
Only this, and I would just say to every person who very kindly sent in their questions, and those who maybe didn't send in questions, but those kind of things are in their mind, and we're hoping that some answer would be attempted to be given. Without a doubt, a free society is a complex society. It's a transformative society. It has the potential to evolve and emerge and change and transform itself in ways and shapes that no one can either anticipate nor is always comfortable for people in the midst of the change and the transformation. In other words, a free society is a dynamic society, and tomorrow will be different than today. And immigration, like any domestic change, influences the form, complexion, and the content and nature of the society. America today is different than the America of 1917 as it was different than the America of 1817. But I would hope that what we've been able to do today, however briefly and perhaps incompletely, is to explain to some of those questioners that some of their concerns are not as serious as they thought, might be misplaced concerns, and that at the end of the day, it is the free society that offers the best opportunity for both the one who has been born in the United States and for those who would like to join the American experiment of the melting pot of freedom.
Yeah, great point, Richard. And I want to thank everybody who sent in your questions. We very appreciate you taking the time. And some of y'all sent some long comments and analyses, which I read carefully, and some very profound and interesting thoughts. Thank you for tuning in. Sorry we went over a little bit this time, but I want to get into most of your questions. You can get more information at fff.org. Richard has a weekly article there on our website. I have a daily blog, and we have articles that we've published, including on immigration, but all aspects of libertarianism that stretch back to January 1990. So thank you for tuning in, Richard. Great show. Enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.
Until next week.